The day I begged my father for help, he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You're old enough to figure it out." Then he turned his back and walked away, hand in hand with his new wife. My heart shattered that night. But what he didn't know was that life had already chosen me for a destiny he could never control. Emily walked up the familiar driveway, her heart pounding heavier with each step. She had rehearsed her words all night, telling herself her father would understand, that he would see her pain and help her like any loving parent should. She knocked softly, and when the door opened, she found him standing there, dressed in a crisp suit, his arm around Kibetsui, his new wife who always looked at Emily like she didn't belong. With trembling hands, Emily explained. She had lost her job, her tuition payments were overdue, and she was desperate for support. Her voice cracked as she pleaded, "Baba, I just need help to stand on my feet again." For a brief second, she searched his face for warmth, for even a flicker of the father she once adored. But his eyes were sharp, his tone colder than the night air. He didn't pull her into an embrace, didn't even soften. Instead, he shook his head, almost annoyed by her presence. "You're old enough to figure it out," he said flatly, his hand tightening on Kibetsui's as if to remind Emily where his loyalty now lay. Emily's breath caught in her chest. She thought maybe he was joking, maybe the man who had once carried her on his shoulders could not possibly turn away now. But then, without hesitation, he turned his back on her. He walked down the hallway with Kibetsui, their laughter echoing faintly as the door closed behind them, leaving Emily outside in silence. Her knees felt weak, her body heavy with disbelief. The night sky above her blurred as her eyes filled with tears. That single sentence, "You're old enough to figure it out," cut deeper than any blade could. It wasn't just rejection, it was abandonment. Her father had chosen wealth, appearances, and his glamorous wife over his own daughter's cry for help. Emily stood frozen on the doorstep, her heart breaking in slow motion. In that moment, she realized she was truly alone. The man she had always seen as her protector, her hero, had just become the first to betray her. And as she walked away into the night, she whispered to herself through the tears, "I will figure it out, but not for him, for me." Emily sat on the cold pavement just a few steps away from the house that had once felt like home. The night was quiet, but inside her chest, a storm was raging. Tears streamed down her face, and no matter how much she wiped them, they kept flowing. She pressed her hands over her mouth, trying to stop the sobs from breaking out, but the pain was too heavy. It wasn't just about losing her job or struggling with tuition. It was about the man she had trusted most in this world looking her in the eyes and turning his back. Her mind dragged her to memories she wished she could forget. She saw her younger self running across the yard, her small arms stretched out, giggling as her father lifted her high into the sky, calling her his little star. She remembered the times he carried her on his shoulders, pointing at the horizon, and telling her she could reach higher than the mountains. Those words had built her confidence. Those moments had shaped her heart. He was her hero, her safe place, her protector. But tonight, those memories twisted like knives. The same man who once promised to never let her fall had pushed her away when she needed him most. Every flashback of his smile now felt like a cruel lie. She saw herself as a child, sitting on his lap as he read her bedtime stories. And then the sharp contrast of his voice tonight, cold, final, dismissive. Emily buried her face in her hands, whispering through her tears, "Why, Baba? Why me?" The weight of abandonment pressed down so hard she could barely breathe. She thought of all the sacrifices she had made to make him proud, all the ways she tried to honor his name. And yet, in her darkest hour, he chose silence, he chose distance, he chose someone else over her. The betrayal wasn't just about money or support, it was about love, or the lack of it. She realized now that the hero she adored no longer existed. The father she once knew was gone, replaced by a stranger who cared more about appearances than his own blood. And as that truth sank in, her tears became a quiet vow. If he had abandoned her, then she would learn to rise without him. The days that followed were some of the hardest Emily had ever lived. With no one to turn to and no father to lean on, she was forced to face life on her own. Her mornings began before sunrise, scrubbing office floors while others still slept. By midday, she was on her feet again, rushing between tables at a small cafe, carrying trays that felt heavier than her own body after hours of standing. When night came, she dragged herself into a small rented room with peeling walls. Her stomach often empty because the little money she earned had to cover rent and books before food. Some nights she lay awake, listening to the sound of her neighbors eating, the aroma of stew slipping through the cracks of her door, while she curled up with only water to fill her belly. Hunger gnawed at her. But what cut deeper was the thought that somewhere across town her father was sitting at a table overflowing with food, laughter, and comfort. She had to choose between a bus fare and bread, between buying candles for light or saving coins for tuition. And every choice felt like another test life was daring her to fail. Meanwhile, Bekazizwe paraded around the community with his new wife Kibetswe, their expensive clothes shining under the sun, their cars polished like trophies. At public events, he raised his glass high, talking about success and hard work, as if his daughter didn't exist. People clapped, praising his achievements, whispering about how lucky Kibetswe was to have such a wealthy man by her side. No one knew that his own blood, his own daughter, was struggling to make it through each day just a few streets away. Amelie sometimes caught sight of him in passing, surrounded by people who admired him. He laughed easily, his face glowing with pride, as though he had never left her crying on the pavement. And in those moments, the sting of rejection grew sharper. She felt invisible, erased from his story. But even in her struggle, Amelie refused to let the pain break her. Each long shift, each empty night, became a brick in the foundation she was building. Life was tearing her down, but deep inside, she knew she was also being prepared to rise. The whispers started softly, like wind brushing through leaves, but soon they grew louder until Amelie couldn't step outside without feeling the sting of eyes watching her. Women at the water pump shook their heads, murmuring that she was unwanted, abandoned by the very man who should have protected her. Children repeated what they overheard at home, pointing and laughing, saying, her own father chose another family over her. Every corner of the community carried a new version of the same painful story, and no matter how strong she tried to be, it echoed in her ears long after she walked away. At the same time, her father's new wife, Kibetswe, was praised like a queen. Neighbors admired her bright dresses, her jewelry that sparkled in the sun, and the way she walked beside Bekazizwe as if she had always belonged. They spoke of her beauty, her charm, her place in the heart of the wealthy man. To Amelie, it felt like the world had chosen sides, and she was left on the outside, stripped of dignity, carrying the label of rejection everywhere she went. But Amelie didn't fight back with words. She lowered her eyes, kept her step steady, and let the silence shield her. Inside, however, every whisper became a flame, burning away her weakness and fueling a fire she didn't even know she carried. What they called unwanted, she began to see as freedom. No expectations, no support, only her and her determination. And if no one believed in her, then she would believe in herself twice as hard. Some evenings, after hearing the cruel gossip, Amelie would sit alone under the old jacaranda tree outside her small room. She closed her eyes and reminded herself of every reason she had to keep going. The education she still dreamed of completing, the life she wanted to build with her own hands, and the promise she once whispered to her late mother, that she would never give up, no matter how heavy the world became. The community could mock her, her father could ignore her, but Amelie silently made a vow. She would endure the shame, turn it into strength, and one day, those very whispers would change. Instead of calling her unwanted, they would speak her name with respect. Amelie was walking home from a long shift at the cafe, her feet aching, her clothes carrying the scent of coffee and grease. The evening streets were quiet, but her mind was restless, filled with thoughts of how far she still had to go. That's when she heard a voice call out behind her. It was Thelani, a respected businessman in the community, known for his sharp mind and generous spirit. He had been a regular at the cafe, often sitting quietly in the corner, observing more than he spoke. This time, however, his eyes weren't just on the cup of tea he usually ordered. They were on her. "You work harder than most people I know," Thelani said, walking beside her. "But I see something in you. You don't break, even when life pushes you down." His words stopped Amelie in her tracks. For so long she had been invisible, dismissed, and looked down upon, even by her own father. Yet here was someone powerful, someone respected, who saw her strength instead of her weakness. Amelie hesitated, not sure if she could trust such kindness. But Thelani's tone was steady, sincere. He told her that he once came from nothing too. and that the world only notices you after you've proven to yourself that you're worthy. Then, almost like he had been waiting for this moment, he offered her an internship at his company. Amelie's eyes widened in disbelief. Me? But I have no degree yet, she stammered. Thilani smiled softly and replied, degrees are paper. Character is power. And you have plenty of that. Those words melted into her heart like light breaking through clouds. For the first time in years, someone believed in her. Not because of her background, not because of her father's name, but because of who she was. She nodded slowly, tears threatening to spill. And Thilani placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Sometimes, he said firmly, rejection is the door to your true beginning. That night, Amelie lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of her room. But for once she didn't feel broken. Instead, she felt the stirrings of hope. The world that had pushed her aside might have unknowingly prepared her for something greater. And with Thilani's guidance, Amelie realized this could be the first step toward rewriting her entire story. Amelie stepped into Thilani's company on her first day with nerves buzzing in her chest. The office was busy, filled with sharp suits and fast-talking professionals who barely noticed her presence. At first, she felt small, like a shadow in a world that moved too quickly. But instead of shrinking, she listened, observed, and absorbed everything like a sponge. When others ignored her, she quietly took notes. When they doubted her, she worked harder. Soon, what seemed impossible began to feel like growth. She started with simple tasks, organizing files, making calls, preparing schedules, but Thilani watched how she handled even the smallest job with care. He slowly entrusted her with bigger responsibilities. Late at night, when most employees had already gone home, Amelie would still be there, studying reports, teaching herself how contracts worked, practicing how to speak with confidence in meetings. Sometimes she would leave the office long after midnight, her body exhausted but her heart burning with determination. Little by little, people began to notice her. At first, whispers in the office questioned why Thilani had chosen her. But as weeks turned into months, those same voices grew quiet when they saw how she carried herself, with patience, grace, and focus. Clients who once overlooked her now began asking for her directly. Colleagues started respecting her opinions, and when she spoke, the room listened. She never demanded attention. She earned it through her quiet strength. Her journey wasn't easy. There were days when she wanted to give up, when the weight of her past rejection crept back into her mind. On those nights, she reminded herself of the pain she felt when her father turned away from her. That wound became her fire. She refused to ever let anyone make her feel unwanted again. By the end of her first year, Amelie was no longer just an intern. She had built relationships, gained trust, and carved her place in the company. Her name carried weight. Her presence carried respect. She had transformed from the girl who once begged for help into a woman building her own foundation. Slowly but surely, Amelie was rising. And this time, nothing and no one could dim her light. Bekizizwe had always walked with his head held high, the kind of man who believed money would never run out. With Kibetswe on his arm, he loved showing off their wealth, lavish parties, designer clothes, expensive cars. But what looked perfect on the outside was slowly falling apart. Kibetswe had a taste for luxury that knew no limits. She spent recklessly, investing in schemes that promised quick profits but collapsed overnight. Bills piled up, creditors started calling, and business partners pulled away when shady deals were exposed. The empire Bekizizwe once bragged about was now cracking beneath him. At first, he pretended nothing was wrong. He would still walk into restaurants with his chest out, tipping waiters with money he didn't have. But behind closed doors, arguments with Kibetswe grew louder. Her voice would slice through the mansion's walls, accusing him of failing to keep up her lifestyle. He too was drowning, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. For a man who once rejected his own daughter, how could he now confess he was losing everything? Meanwhile, whispers about Amelie began to circle back to him. At first, he brushed them off. Rumors of her growing reputation, stories of her hard work at Thilani's company. He scoffed, telling himself she was still the same girl he abandoned. But the whispers grew louder. Friends mentioned seeing her name on business documents. Old associates spoke of her confidence in meetings. Even Kibetswe, with jealousy dripping from her tone, told him, "Your daughter is becoming someone important." Each time her name was mentioned, Bekizizwe's stomach twisted. He tried to ignore it, but the irony stung. The daughter he cast aside, the one he told to figure it out, was now being spoken of with respect in circles that once belonged to him. Still, his pride chained him. Instead of reaching out, he chose silence. He let his empire sink while pretending to be untouchable. Deep down, he knew the truth he refused to face. While his world was falling apart, Amelie's was quietly rising. The tables were beginning to turn, and soon, the man who once walked away from his daughter would be forced to watch her step into the very power he thought she could never have. The night of the gala shimmered with golden lights and polished marble floors. Expensive cars lined the entrance, and inside the grand hall, the air buzzed with the sound of glasses clinking, cameras flashing, and powerful voices exchanging deals. Amelie, dressed with quiet elegance, walked into the room not as the girl who once begged for help, but as a woman recognized for her strength and influence. Her name was on the guest list as guest of honor, and people greeted her with firm handshakes and genuine respect. She felt a mixture of pride and disbelief. This was the very world she once thought was far beyond her reach. But just as she was settling into the night, her eyes caught sight of two familiar figures walking in through the doors. Her father, Bekizizwe, and his wife Kibetswe, dressed in clothes that screamed wealth, but carried an energy that was desperate, even forced. They no longer had the same glow of power they once flaunted. Instead, they moved from table to table with wide smiles, trying to impress, trying to convince potential investors to trust them. Yet the sharper eyes in the room could see through them. The cracks in their empire were no longer hidden. For a moment, Amelie's heart stopped. She never imagined she would face them here, in this place, at this moment. Memories of rejection flashed through her mind. Her father turning his back, his cold words, his hand holding Kibetswe's as they left her standing alone. But tonight, the tables had turned. She wasn't the one on the outside anymore, they were. As she watched them, she noticed how few people paid them real attention. Some nodded politely, others brushed them off with excuses. Kibetswe's forced laughter grew sharper, while Bekizizwe's smile looked thinner with every rejection. Amelie realized they weren't here as the powerful. They were here as beggars dressed in designer suits. The irony burned deeply. The man who once told her to figure it out was now scrambling for approval. In the same circles where her name was spoken with admiration. And though she hadn't yet said a word, her very presence in that room, as the honored guest, was louder than any rejection he had ever given her. The stage was set, and the night was only beginning. The lights in the hall dimmed, and all eyes turned to the stage as the host tapped the microphone. The crowd hushed, waiting for the next announcement. A drum roll played softly in the background, and then the words rang out like a bell. Tonight, we honor a young woman who has broken barriers and rewritten the rules. The youngest woman in this country to secure a multi-million-dollar contract, Amelie Mthembu. For a second, Amelie froze in her seat. The applause roared around her like thunder, echoing off the walls. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, chanting her name. Cameras flashed as she walked gracefully to the stage, her gown sweeping the floor, her steps steady and proud. She wasn't just Amelie anymore. She was a symbol of resilience, the living proof that rejection could be turned into triumph. Gasps spread across the room, and Amelie didn't need to look to know where they were coming from. Her father's face, once painted with arrogance, was now pale and stiff, his jaw clenched as the truth sank in. The daughter he had dismissed, the girl he left to struggle alone, was now the star of the very world he had once ruled. Kibetswe shifted uncomfortably beside him, her painted smile faltering as whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. "Is that his daughter?" One voice whispered. "The one he abandoned?" Another asked. "He must be choking right now," someone muttered under their breath. Amelie stood at the microphone, her voice calm but strong. She thanked her mentor, her team, and the people who believed in her. But deep inside, she knew this moment was about more than business. It was about dignity. Each word she spoke echoed not only in the ears of the audience but in the heart of the man who once told her she wasn't his responsibility. And as she looked out over the sea of faces, her eyes finally met her father's. For the first time he couldn't look away. The pride he once had in himself had shattered, replaced by a silent, painful realization. The daughter he had abandoned was now the most powerful person in the room, and nothing he could do would ever change that. The gala was over, the chandeliers dimmed, and people slowly trickled out of the grand hall, still whispering Amelie's name like a song. She stood near the entrance, shaking hands, her calm smile hiding the storm of emotions she carried inside. Just as she turned to leave, she heard a voice she hadn't heard up close in months, hesitant, shaky, stripped of its usual authority. It was her father, Bekazizwe. He walked toward her slowly, the same man who once walked away without looking back. But tonight, there was no pride in his stride, no arrogance in his eyes. His face carried the weight of shame, and his voice was no longer commanding but pleading. "Amelie," he said softly, almost like a stranger. "I was wrong. I see that now. Please forgive me. Help me. I need you." For a moment, Amelie felt her chest tighten. This was the man she had once adored, the man she had begged for love and support. But as she looked at him now, hollow, desperate, she realized the power he once held over her heart was gone. She stood tall, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "You told me to figure it out," she said calmly, the words slicing through the air like a final verdict. "I did. And I figured out I never needed you to begin with." Her father's shoulders slumped as if those words carried the weight of every mistake he had ever made. Kibetswe lingered behind him, avoiding Amelie's eyes, her once bright confidence shattered. Silence hung heavy, and in that silence, Amelie's dignity shone brighter than any chandelier in that hall. Without raising her voice, without anger, she had closed a chapter that once defined her pain. She turned away, walking out into the cool night, the city lights reflecting on her face like a crown she had earned with every tear, every sleepless night, every battle fought alone. Narration closed softly, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. He walked away with his new life, but I walked into mine, and mine was stronger than he ever imagined. Amelie's steps echoed with freedom, not from her father's approval, but from her own unshakable strength. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll past. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that pain can turn into power. Gemstone Sparkles follow for more emotional stories that will keep you hooked till the very last word. Red Heart Fire.